There's only one authority on the Tennessee Titans, and that's the Tennessean. And there's only one show that's an authority too, and you've found it. This is Talkin' Titans.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Talkin' Titans. I'm Tennessean sports columnist Gentry Estes, alongside Tennessean Titans beat writer Ben Arthur. We're going to be reviewing a game that didn't go so well for the Titans,
to say the least, Gentry.
Yeah, not a good weekend in New York. An overtime loss to the Jets. The Titans are 2-2, heading into this week's game in Jacksonville. And much like the earlier loss this season for the Titans, you come away from this one with quite a few concerns and things to worry about this team that can't stay healthy, can't stop big plays defensively, can't convert in the red zone offense. Anyway, we're going to get into all that. There's a lot of concerns, and we're going to weigh in on each one. How serious do we think these things are? Do we think they're going to linger the rest of the season? But meanwhile, I'm just glad at this point to welcome Ben back to the show. You may have noticed we took a week off on the Talkin' Titans podcast. Ben, how are you feeling? You getting back to full strength here?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Gentry. For those of you who aren't aware, I had COVID, and so that forced me to miss the Jets trip. I wasn't able to do the podcast last week because I just didn't sound great. I'm excited to be able to get back on the field, get back to doing on-field reporting at the end of this week. I can officially end my quarantine on Saturday, although I already feel pretty good, and so I will be in Jacksonville and kind of ready to kind of get back on the beat. But yeah, it was, man, it's kind of frustrating, but also, kind of concerning too, because I had the vaccine and was experiencing some symptoms, mild symptoms, but regardless, I did experience a few of kind of like a cough and headache, things like that. But I am feeling good now. I appreciate you asking, Gentry, and excited to kind of get back to on-field football stuff. So excited and pumped to be ending this quarantine at the end of this week. It has been very frustrating to say the least, not being able to do a lot, and it's kind of mentally and physically, it's kind of tough. But the most important thing is I am healthy and I am well, so excited to kind of get back into the groove of things. But yeah,
no question. Glad to hear that. And we were our Tennessean staff was shorthanded in New York this last weekend, and the Titans were also quite shorthanded in New York this last weekend. And Ben, I guess we don't want to depress everybody by coming into this every week and saying, gosh, there are all these concerns. But I mean, there are. You lost, the Titans lost a very winnable game to a pretty bad team in the Jets. So yeah, I got a couple of responses from this weekend, my columns. You're so negative, kicking them when they're down. Well, it's like, well, you lose to the Jets, come on.
Yeah. And it's not only, I don't think it's only the injuries too. And I think there are kind of schematic issues as well. And I think that's kind of a perfect segue into discussing the multitude of issues that the Titans are facing right now. So right now, so what we're going to do, folks, we're going to sort of go through a handful of the issues that the Titans are facing right now and kind of discuss our concern, or what the concern level should be with each of them. And as I said, injuries weren't kind of the only thing. I do feel like a lot of the issues have been schematic. And so I think that's the perfect segue to start with the offensive play calling. Todd Downing, obviously new offensive coordinator, filling in for Arthur Smith, who's now the coach of the Falcons. Gentry, we've talked about the whole Downing, the potential Downing impact. Or earlier this season, this was kind of like one of our big things to watch with this offense. We know what happened when he became the offensive coordinator with the Raiders several years ago. He had inherited a really talented Raiders offense. The next year, they finished in the bottom third of the league in basically most of the kind of efficiency metrics, and kind of the same thing. And obviously it's still early, but what we've seen is an offense that's supposed to have all this talent, and they've started to regress. And I know the injuries have been a concern, but when you look at the kind of their red zone numbers, like they were first, they were top 2 in the league in red zone in 2019 and 2020. And right now, Gentry, they're 27th in red zone efficiency. And they still have, amid all the injuries that they've still had Derrick Henry. They still have Ryan Tannehill. They still have most of those old linemen. Red zone has been a huge issue. And even, and I will say in Seattle, that when they did have Julio and AJ, they went 0 for 3 to start in the red zone at Seattle. So it's not like these are only issues that are coming up when guys are hurt. It seems like the play calling has been somewhat has lacked somewhat of a creative element. I think there should be tons of concerns here. For me, Gentry, the play calling on offense is maybe the biggest concern, because in football you're going to have the injuries, right? But if this right scheme isn't in place, I think you'll have issues from there. So that's kind of what I'm feeling about the play calling. How about you?
Well, I think obviously the red zone stuff is a concern. There's no doubt about it. And I think you do look at the play call. I think this has manifested itself in several different ways. A few things about this. I think some of the protection issues could be schematic in terms of guys just coming free and they don't see them coming. That's concerning, and it was especially concerning on third down against the Jets. What the Jets did, they just played a bunch of man coverage and came after Tannehill. Now, do I think they would have been so confident in doing that had A.J. Brown and Julio Jones been on the field? I'm not so sure. But I think you've seen in the red zone, they're not as good at tight end this year. Anthony Firkser's been hurt. Firkser's been big in the red zone for them in the past. He really hasn't been healthy. I think that's a big deal. They haven't been able to rely on the tight ends. Jonnu Smith was really productive in the red zone. I think that's a very big part of this.
Yeah.
And when you look at what happened against the Jets, there were a lot of throws. Those first 3 possessions that ended in field goals, there were a lot of throws into the end zone. Guys just weren't open. And I know, we're not going to – I agree, injuries happen to every team. But when you are looking at some of these third downs and you're seeing who's on the field for the Titans, it's not exactly a who's who list of NFL talent at wide receiver. It's just not. These guys are all kind of role players and 3, 4, 5 guys in a rotation. They're not. Nick Westbrook-Akine is not a number 1 receiver in the NFL, and I think it manifests itself in the red zone if guys not getting open. Space is limited, and I'll agree that the play calling, it could have been better. But honestly, I think after the first week, I was very critical of Todd Downing after the first week against the Cardinals. Since then, I think it's gotten better. But they need to get their best guys on the field. They don't have them right now.
Yeah, but I would say too, Gentry. I mean, isn't it? We have seen the Titans being forced to roll out a lot of these reserves, but I think it also is. It's on Todd Downing to kind of figure it out as well. I mean, we know injuries are going to happen in the NFL, and maybe and obviously the Titans are dealing with more than the average, but I think it's on the play caller to kind of put the guys he does have available in positions to be successful. And this entire offseason, weren't we talking about how deep the Titans were supposed to be at receiver, right? Like people were saying, they have so much depth there beyond, Julio and AJ. And so I think it's time for that depth to to show itself, right? I think maybe what we'll see Marcus Johnson, who was really one of the stars of training camp in the preseason, he could come back, could be activated this week. So I think that's something to watch. Nick Westbrook Akina, he popped up on the injury report, so you don't know about him. But Chester Rogers is another guy who you need to step up as well. I mean, I think it's time for that depth that we talked about in the offseason at receiver in particular to start showing up a bit.
At no point 5 weeks into the season does the line Chester Rogers needs to step up a good thing for the Titans.
That's fair.
I'm sorry, Chester. I love Chester Rogers is an overachiever in the NFL. He is. He's earned what he's gotten. He's a good return man, but he was not supposed to be the guy in the red zone. You have A.J. Brown, Julio Jones, Anthony Ferguson. Those three all were supposed to step up and be the guy in the red zone. They haven't been healthy. So I feel like we can not blame injuries, because when you talk to the Titans, they're not going to blame injuries because it sounds like an excuse. Number one, it sounds like an excuse. And number two, the guys like Ryan Tannehill, Mike Vrabel, Derrick Henry, they're not going to sit there and say this receiver isn't as good as these other receivers, even though we all know that's true.
Yeah.
And I when you went up to New York, they showed the inactive list before the game for the Titans up on the big screen, and there was more talent on that list than there might have been on the field in a blue jersey. I'm sorry. There just was. You can't lose AJ and Julio. Burks are still coming back from injury. You know, look, these guys are trying, but at some point, the NFL comes down to players making plays in one-on-one situations, and the Titans do not have enough guys in their passing game right now that can do that. Healthy.
I'll agree with that. Yeah, that's a fair point.
That said, could Todd Downing be better?
Yeah, yeah, of course, yes, yes. And ultimately, a lot of things need to improve, and that's kind of a segue into kind of my next concern point: the pass protection. Tannehill has been sacked 17 times so far this season. Through 4 games, he was sacked 24 times all of last year through 16 games. He's on pace to being sacked more than 2019 and 2020 combined, if you can believe that. They're dealing with injuries up front, guys kind of in and out of the lineup. Lawan he's come back from the torn ACL, but he's kind of been in and out. He's had setbacks. Roger Saffold had a concussion protocol situation over the weekend. Ben Jones was kind of in and out this past weekend, needing backups to step up. And then David Kessenberry, who's been the right tackle for the Titans so far this season, has struggled a little bit, I think, especially in that Jets game. What's your concern level, Gentry, with where the pass protection is at?
Yeah, this is pretty high on the concern meter for me. I think, I think coming into this season, everyone looked at that Titans offense and they're like, oh, you got Tannehill and Henry and Brown and Julio Jones. What could a defensive coordinator do to stop it? Well, here's what the defense coordinator is doing to stop it. They're coming after Tannehill, and they're having success doing it because they're not being able to protect him up front for a number of factors. I think you mentioned the injuries. I think schematically they've had some issues with it, and some of it is just guys just getting whipped. And right now the Titans are having all those issues. Way too many sacks for any NFL team, but especially one whose backups experience is pretty much limited to the Alliance of American Football or whatever league it was that Logan Woodside played in. And I'm not saying Logan Woodside couldn't step up and be the guy, but I seem to remember Matt Barkley almost beating him out in the preseason, which is probably not a positive sign. So yes, you want to keep Ryan Tannehill healthy. It's a very big concern at this point. They have not been able to. I think you can kind of write off the 6 sacks and with the Cardinals as Chandler Jones just kind of had a day, and you're like, okay.
And Lawan was also really, really bad in that game too. But yeah, to your point, Jones is great. Chandler Jones is great.
But to have it happen again against the Jets and have 7 sacks in that game, I mean, the Jets, there was a lot on third down, and I did it. It is a big concern. Again, I think some of it had to do with a team that could send more people because they knew they could leave their corners alone with the receivers on the edge and not be punished for it. And you don't know if they knew A.J. Brown and Julio Jones weren't going to play in that game, but they had a good scheme. I asked Ryan Tannehill today if defenses are playing the Titans differently this year when it comes to the pressure they're generating versus what they weren't able to do a year ago against largely, mostly the same people. And, he said the Jets didn't really do something they weren't expecting. And it's like, well, gee, that's concerning.
Yeah.
Because if you expected what they were going to do, then how did they end up giving 7 sacks? And I think some of that is just your natural inclination to answer a media's question by, not wanting to say they surprised us. But if they didn't surprise you and you gave up 7 sacks, that's a big problem, isn't it?
Yeah. And look, as bad as the Jets are, that their defense has been quite good to start the season. Actually, like they came into that game Sunday number 1 in red zone defense. They were a top 4 team on third down. They've been a team that can kind of get after quarterbacks. But I do think this is a schematic issue, because we can talk about the injuries, but the Titans' run game has still been really good. Right.
Very true. And you would think that would set up the play action and make that more successful.
Exactly. And so if they're having all this success in the run game, despite all the injuries, then to me, I mean, it has to be the scheme, whether it means, more 3-step drops or quick hitters or the screen, like the screen game was there a lot in New York, and maybe it means doing more of that, or I think it all kind of goes back to the scheme, and that doesn't mean the guys up front don't need to play better. They absolutely do. It's been awful to start the season, but when you look at the success they're having in run blocking for Derrick Henry, and all the success they've been able to generate up front for him, I think you do have to look at kind of formations and kind of what they're doing from a scheme standpoint to neutralize pass rushes. So I do think you have to look at that.
And I do think all the screen passes were a result of the Jets selling out to bring the pressure the way they were. I think that's one of the reasons they kept relying on the screen passes, but they also had no hope of a downfield passing game. I think that was also a function of that too. I think you didn't have receivers getting open down the field, but you also didn't have time to find him anyway. Yeah. So good job by the Jets. They from a scheme standpoint, they won the game that way defensively. Absolutely. They did. Absolutely.
So to kind of move on to the next thing, and Gentry, we've kind of already been talking about it with the play calling, the pass protection, but injuries, and this is not just on offense. This is both sides of the ball. The Taylor Lewan's issues, Roger Saffold's issues, Ben Jones being in and out, A.J. Brown being out, Julio Jones being out, Bud Dupree not being a factor at this point, and he's been inactive a little bit. Caleb Farley, your first-round corner, has missed 3 straight games. How big of an issue, Gentry, do you think injuries are at this point in the season?
I would rank this. If we're sitting here saying what's the biggest problem, this to me is the biggest problem. And again, I think, yeah, I mean, any football team is going to be dealing with injuries. But what the Titans are faced with right now, to be only 5 weeks into the season, is extreme. If you can go find the injury report that came out. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. You can go find the injury report that came out today. And our colleague Terry McCormick said it looked like a phone book what the Titans have, and it did. The Titans had I don't know how many names compared to the Jaguars, who had like 3 or 4. So it was ridiculous how long the injury report was for a Wednesday, and it's a concern to me because a team's going to get beat up over the course of a season, but we're only 4 weeks in, and the Titans are already sitting here dealing with this. They've also had. The guys that are having it happen are key players too. I mean, we talked about AJ and Julio, but you also got Bud Dupree on the defensive side of the ball. The offensive line can't stay healthy. It seems like all those guys have been dealing with something. There is hardly an area of the team that they can't even get a kicker to the first game. Now the best punter, one of the best punters in the league, isn't even out there. It's every aspect of the team is being affected substantially by this, and if it's happening in week 4, it's not going to get much better. I mean, you're already really testing the depth of this team, and that's the kind of thing that really isn't supposed to happen until you get a lot later into this than they are right now. So I think it's early, and they can get guys healthy, and things can improve, but I mean, it's just a lot of talent for a team. And I, just to mention this, because I think it deserves to be mentioned, this is a lot of absences for a team that spent their first round pick on a guy who wasn't healthy and was going to be a project, and Caleb Farley, for a guy whose big free agent signing was a guy in Bud Dupree who wasn't healthy, and you didn't know for sure if he'd be available in week 1. And and then you also bring in Julio Jones, who doesn't really practice in August. Then he pulls a hamstring, which is what happens when you don't practice. A.J. Brown didn't practice in August. Then he pulls a hamstring. That's what happens. These are all things that I don't think, Ben, that it's just bad luck.
Yeah.
And that's really the most concerning aspect of it to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And look, the rash of injuries they've had is kind of far exceeded normal, but John Robinson did take this gamble when the season started, right? I mean, you took on Julio Jones, like to create what the team had hoped would be like this Super Bowl championship contender. You were coming into this season taking a gamble on a lot of these injured guys, and a lot of those gambles haven't paid off so far. You mentioned it with Dupree. He's your big money signing, like $82.5 million. He has not been an impact. He's not been an impact player heading into the 5th game of the season. Caleb Farley hasn't played. He's only played in the opener, and he's basically a 3rd string cornerback at this point when he has played. Julio Jones had hamstring issues last season. That's why he only played 9 games. You trade for him, hoping he's kind of like that missing piece for you. And then he misses, now he's dealing with a hamstring issue. So while the Titans are kind of dealing with just an enormous amount of injuries and a bunch of it you can't really have foreseen, John Robinson did sort of take on that risk when creating this 2021 roster, that you were kind of banking on these injured guys to pan out for you. And so far that hasn't happened. But to kind of move on, this is kind of our last point. The last point I have listed, Gentry, is the secondary. I think the Jets game is the latest example of kind of the Tennessee having those back-breaking breakdowns in the back end. In the Jets game, the Titans held New York to 10 points through 3 quarters, and then all of a sudden Zach Wilson completes I want to say like a 50-something yarder to set up a field goal. Then there's a defensive pass interference by Dan Cruikshank that sets up a touchdown, and then there's another 50-yard touchdown from Corey Davis. And then if you go back even to the Seattle game where they gave up 3 plays of at least 50 yards, including 2 60-yard touchdowns. The secondary has been a really, really big issue for this defense. Gentry, how big of an issue do you think it is so far?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's because things were so bad defensively last season. I don't view this one as much of an issue because I actually think defensively they've been better so far this year. I think the Titans defense has actually been okay, but they have been giving up too many big plays, and it's happened in 3 of the 4 games. And of the 4 games, there was one game that involved a quarterback that was barely mobile and couldn't extend a play and could barely stand up. So yeah, that week it didn't happen so much, but the other weeks they've dealt with quarterbacks who extended plays and did a good job of that. Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson, now Zach Wilson was able to do the same thing. And some of these throws in the game, you're like, against the Jets were, you're kind of like, are you kidding me? I mean, the Titans did have somebody standing there. Vrabel made the line today that it felt like a Hail Mary in some cases. And I will say the touchdown to Corey Davis did kind of feel that way. And I so maybe a low percentage kind of deal, but you know what? They still hit them. And it's happened so much. It's happened so often now that you can't call it a fluke. You can say it's something that the Titans are going to have to correct. So yeah, I mean, it's clearly a concern. And it's got to be very frustrating for the guys on that defense because they played pretty well in this game. We were at one point pretty deep into this game, maybe late third quarter. The Jets were sitting there with like 80 yards or something like that. I mean, the Titans had played pretty well defensively, and then all of a sudden it kind of got away from them. So I think you could see maybe the light at the end of the tunnel a lot better this year than you could last year, but still in the tunnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that situation late in the third, like if the Titans had just, and then I think it kind of goes back to the offensive issues, right? The defense gave the offense a chance, right? But then like early in the game, when you have 3 straight, when you go 0-3 in the red zone to start, all of a sudden those defensive issues at the end look a lot worse. I mean, they were really, they were bad, of course, but you look at the offense, if they had just kind of converted on those touchdown opportunities, that we'd maybe be looking at this game a lot differently. But yeah, I would overall kind of, agree with you. This defense has made strides. And Christian Fulton, for the most part, has looked really good. Jack Rabbit Jenkins, I think he's maybe been a little inconsistent, and you don't really have it doesn't appear the Titans really have a slot guy that they trust right now. Elijah Molden is just not a factor, the rookie third rounder. I know Chris Jackson has kind of been in and out of the lineup a little bit, but I think one thing the Titans do need, they really need Amani Hooker back. Right. And I don't know how serious his injury is, and he's been on injured reserve. He's the hope is that he comes back soon, but the way he looked, even dating back to last year and into training camp preseason with KB, Kevin Byard in the back end, I think not having him has really hurt a lot, and the Titans safety depth has really been tested. We saw in that Seattle game, you had to roll out with Bradley McDougald, and a guy who had kind of joined the team late on the practice squad, got signed to the active roster when Amani went to IR, and that didn't work out so well. And the Titans really just don't have a lot of options at safety right now. So I think having Amani Hooker back there can help, but for overall, and as you alluded to, I think this defense has made progress. I think what we've seen, Harold Landry has just been balling out, by the way, like the amount of pressure he's able to get game in and game out, even if all of those pressures aren't necessarily turning into sacks. He's been really promising. We've seen other guys kind of show up in that defensive front too. So I think overall the product has been better, but then just when you kind of give up a 50-yarder here, a 60-yarder here in the back end, it kind of it kind of dilutes maybe a little bit, what they've done, even if they're having progress from last year.
Yeah, you touched on one thing that we're talking about concerns. Here's one that I want to mention is the fact that you mentioned a lot, Farley, Molden, those guys haven't done anything yet. In this Jets game, the only member of the Titans draft class who had any snaps offensively or defensively was Racey McMath as a 6th-round receiver. He was the only rookie who was drafted rookie who played any offensive or defensive. That's
insane. Oh my God.
That is a big problem. And the sad thing is, Ben, it's the exact same problem they had last year.
Yep.
Their class didn't do anything to help them. And I'll give them Christian Fulton. He has stepped up and been an awfully good player this year. So you can't say that last year's class was a complete bust because he's played well. But who are you Farley's inactive. Dylan Radins is inactive. Monty Rice is only playing special teams. Elijah Molden was only playing special teams in this game. Rashad Weaver's banged up, and you're looking at another season in which you have no rookies helping build depth, and it is awfully hard to win football games that way, especially when you do it 2 years in a row. And at some point, it really didn't hurt the Titans that much last year, and I made the point repeatedly last year, hey, they're kind of lucky this isn't hurting them. I just don't know if they're going to get away with that for a second year in a row. That they can't have another draft class bust, and they appear to be headed that direction.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just with Farley specifically, I mean, he was always going to be a long-term project, right? Like the hope being that maybe he'd have an impact for you later in his rookie season and into year 2. But with all the other guys, I mean, Elijah Molden had been looked at as like a steal in the draft, and the Dylan Radins coming in as what the Titans surely hoped would be their starting right tackle, maybe right away, and yeah, it has not been good, and one of the key.
Yeah, I mean the whole offensive line's banged up. Wouldn't you want your second round pick to be active?
Yeah, the fact that he's not even active, even about him like just not being out there, like they can't even get him active when you have all these injuries. So that's a major red flag for a second round pick.
Yeah, no doubt. So to me, we're talking about concerns. I think that's one as well. But I guess we should end on, more of a positive note. They are 2-2. There are some teams. You look around the NFL right now. There's some pretty good teams that are 2-2. I think a positive note would be probably our predictions for this weekend in Jacksonville. Ben, we haven't even talked about Urban Meyer yet. I guess we could have really spent the whole show on that. So, look, if you're listening to this, you probably know exactly what's been going on with Urban Meyer and the fact that the Jaguars, quite a bit of controversy involving their coach. I think it's a huge distraction for them this week. Not a good situation for a team that was already 0-4. It kind of goes without saying. And Ben, I also think the Jaguars are going to be getting a Titans team in a bad mood this weekend, and a team that knows how to beat up on the Jags because they've done it a lot the last few years.
Exactly.
I like the Titans big, and I'm not going to say this a lot this season, but whatever the point spread is, I think the Titans beat it significantly in this game.
Yeah, this is the game for the Titans to kind of say the past is the past. Well, we have a clearly inferior opponent with a coach dealing with a circus. We have to go in and just kick some butt and kick, and really, really just pile it on them. And so I think anything less than a blowout would be sort of a disappointment here. And look, you look at their schedule past Jacksonville. It's when their schedule really, really gets tough, right? If you remember, we had talked about in the preseason how tough that middle of the schedule would be. After Jacksonville, they have Buffalo on Monday Night Football. They have the Chiefs the next Sunday, and then they have at the Colts and then at the Rams. I think if you're the Titans, you need to start feeling good about yourselves, get a good win under your belt, get a convincing win, a win that reminds you who you are in Jacksonville. So I think with the circus that the Jaguars are dealing with, I think this is a perfect opportunity for the Titans to kind of get back on track and build some confidence.
Yeah, agree. All right, well, that'll do it for this edition of Talking Titans. We hope you'll subscribe to Tennessean.com if you haven't already. Remember to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, wherever it is you get your podcasts. Drop us a review and a rating while you're at it. For Ben Arthur, I'm Gentry Estes. Thanks for listening.
Talkin' Titans hosts at Tennessean.com. You can also subscribe to Talkin' Titans for free on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. I'm Sean King. Talkin' Titans is a production of the Tennessean.